All right, hello and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our second Building Better Business webinar. It's our first one of 2021. My name is Luke Fry. I'm the Associate Communications Director at BBB Serving Connecticut. My colleague Joni is also on our call today. She's going to be helping out with the Q&A after we hear from Bert. So Happy New Year, everybody. I hope that these webinars help take you and your business into a new and prosperous year. I think after yesterday, a lot of us really want to turn a new page and come into 2021 and not necessarily look back into 2020. However, those of us that dare want to even look into the future of 2021, and that is where Bert Brenner comes into play. Welcome, Bert. He is the Director of Investment and Economic Research at People's United Advisors. We appreciate you for joining us today, and I am going to turn things over to you.
Thanks, Luke, and I'm very happy to be here. It's usually when I make these sorts of presentations, I like to wander around the audience, or to wander around at least the lectern or the dais. I think it helps keep everybody awake and focused. So we'll see how we can do it without that. Those of you who happened to see the Heisman Trophy presentation the other evening saw that some of the people on that presentation were rather stone-faced in their appearance. So, Luke, if I get to that point, let me know.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm going to launch in here now. Luke, you let me know when I did hit the show my screen. Can you see it now?
Yep, it's up. If you just put your PowerPoint into slideshow, I think you're all good to go.
Great, good. From the beginning. Okay. And I need to just change this. Okay, here we are.
All right.
So I hope you'll excuse the pun. Sorry, Luke, all set?
Yep, all set.
Yeah, good. I hope you'll. Yeah, good. I hope you'll all excuse the pun on the title here, "A Shot in the Arm." Certainly, that's a indication of giving something, someone some stimulus and so on. Of course, it has a very important double meaning for us here as we move into 2021 and beyond. So I'm going to show you a series of charts here and graphs along with some commentary. I've got 40 slides overall. I think we should be able to get through all of those and leave time for questions. Although if you do have questions, I think we're using the chat function. And if anything is particularly pertinent right at the moment, I know Joni is going to interrupt me to address that question if that's appropriate at the time. Some of the data you're going to see here is going to be a little surprising. It is surprising because, frankly, when I looked at it, it was surprising to me. But we'll get going here. Luke said it best. This is a cartoon, the Mutz cartoon that appeared in the paper here in the Hartford Courant just a couple of days ago. How can we make this year better than last year? How can we not? Well, unfortunately, we found a way not to make it better. And of course, we witnessed that yesterday with the first invasion of the Capitol in a large scale since the War of 1812. There have been some minor disturbances that have occurred since then and before yesterday, but yesterday was a major one. And of course, it's just a reminder that that things are mixed And that's very much a theme that prevailed throughout 2020. You're going to see it in the data here, that it was in some respects the best of times, and you may be surprised by that, and certainly in other respects, as we all know too well, the worst of times. So in terms of the best of times, well, the S&P 500 had a total stock market return for the year of almost 18.5%. The price alone was up 16%, and that's what you probably see in the paper. But with the reinvestment of dividends, it was up 18%. Of course, it was a real roller coaster ride. The market fell almost 34% from its previous peak on February 20th to that trough here on March 23rd. But since then, since March 23rd, the market's gone up almost 68%. So if you were unfortunately captive to the emotions of the moment and sold out of your equities in February and March, I hope you jumped back in. So little advertisement for my business. We didn't do that. In fact, we increased our equity weighting right around here. The impact of the rising stock market brought household net worth to an all-time high. And this is as of November of this year. A dip, of course, related to the stock market sell-off, but then a recovery here. And this recovery represents not only just the value of people's investments, but also the value of their real estate. Real per capita disposable income soared during the early months of the pandemic. That came down, but still, after that peak, was still up 2% from the prior level before the pandemic hit, which was a historical peak level, and you can see that from the chart here. The real per capita income, of course, this represents the spike here represents the monies that were distributed to the $1,200 that was distributed in the result of the CARES Act, putting a lot of money in people's pockets. That was important. But as I said, though, it was not just a function of the securities markets, the stock market, but also home prices. This is the Federal Housing Agency House Purchase Index for the United States. It hit an all-time high again in the third quarter. And you can see that the rate of increase accelerated here right after, let's see, that would be right after April. So lots of good things. Here in Connecticut, we had the dedication of the John Oliver Memorial Sewer Plant in Danbury. And I struggled to find one of the best of times displays here for the state, but this I thought was worth looking at and perhaps having a chuckle over. Of course, though, it was the worst of times, and the coronavirus plague that the entire world has been hit with, causing the COVID-19 disease. We are now, as a country, in the third wave of that. The first wave occurring here in March and April, as we all know well, that precipitated the shutdown of the economy. A smaller second wave occurring in July and August. The U.S. is the dark blue line here, by the way. And then, of course, the wave that we're in right now here. We're showing on the chart also the experience of some other countries worldwide. This is a pandemic, meaning worldwide. And you can see that sadly the United States case here is actually the worst. The light blue line here is Brazil. Let's see, the dotted brown line is Mexico, and this sharp purple line here, if you will, is the United Kingdom, which of course is struggling now to contain the spreading of a new variant of the coronavirus. The impact of the onset of the pandemic and our response to that was essentially a self-imposed recession. We shut down the economy, all but the most essential businesses, asked people to stay at home, and in the process of 2 months, we lost 22 million jobs. Unemployment, you can see this is the job level. You can see the column dropping dramatically here from a level of over 150 million to a level of 130 million, roughly speaking. We lost 22 million jobs. Unemployment soared from a 3.2, 3.4 level up to nearly 15%. Again, all in a matter of 2 months. Unprecedented. And unfortunately, the use of that term itself has become unprecedented. The impact of that, not just on jobs, of course, is a dramatic impact on consumer sentiment. This is the components of the consumer sentiment index as produced by the surveys of consumer operation out of the University of Michigan. This is a survey that they have conducted going back to the late 40s. Oftentimes, one will see in the press the Consumer Confidence Index, which is a very similar index done by the Conference Board. The University of Michigan index here, or the index, is in the public domain, so it's one we refer to. And if you overlaid them, you'll see that they track the same thing, and it's not that surprising. The impact of the coronavirus, the pandemic, caused the most precipitous drop in consumer sentiment in the history of the series, going back to the late 70s. It's shown here from 1980 forward. And that we can see we've had some sharp declines in previous, but the one that we had in the early 2020 was the sharpest in history. There are 3 things tracked here. You can see them indicated in the legend down below. The composite, the sentiment index, this is sort of the equivalent of the consumer confidence index, which is currently at 80.7, this level right about here. And you can see how that compares with the level that has prevailed throughout the last several expansions and recessions. So we're at a level that is lower than most times recorded here. That sentiment index is actually a composite of 2 other indices, and the composites are one that where the survey asks for people's opinion about the future, and then asks them their opinion about their current conditions. And the consumer confidence survey index is constructed in the exact same way, actually. So what do you think about the way things are now? What do you think about the way things are likely going to be? And the drop in the current conditions sentiment, which is the red one, you can see the line here masked, that was an extraordinary decline from a level near a peak level to a level typical of and even below levels typical of a recession. Again, not a particular surprise, but the magnitude and the sharpness of the decline is particularly noteworthy. One of the key facts about the recession that we've gone through, and I use the past tense there because although the gurus up in Boston who actually date the starts and ends of recession haven't dated the end of the coronavirus recession, the standard is that recessions go from the peak to the trough of economic activity, and then once economic activity reaches a trough, then we go into an expansion stage. The early parts of the expansion stage are, of course, just a recovery, getting back, and then hopefully beyond that, moving above what the level of economic activity was before the recession. clearly, we've been in an expansion actually since May. Economists were very surprised when the May jobs numbers came out positive, because in fact they were expecting that the jobs numbers was going to be quite a bit lower. It was actually going to decrease. But one thing that is characteristic of this recession is that it is the most unequal in modern times, in the sense that of its impact on people. It has been concentrated. The adverse impact has been concentrated on the lowest earning segment of the population or the workforce. And again, I think we all have a sort of instinctive understanding of why that was the case. And I'll get to a slide just in a moment to get into that. But on top of the unequal economic effect, the disease itself has had a very disparate impact. And in fact, it has also had the most severe impact on the more disadvantaged sectors of our population. This table here shows, in fact, what the likelihood is of dying from a case of COVID-19. This is all with reference to what the average is for a white non-Hispanic person. So if you are American Indian or an Alaskan Native, your likelihood of death by COVID-19 is 2.6 times what the rate is for non-Hispanic whites. If you're African American, your likelihood of death is 2.8 times, and if you're Hispanic, it's 2.8 times also. And I might note that this is not essentially a race-related characteristic. And we get into some of the facts about genetics here, but it's primarily a socioeconomic susceptibility. And that's because of the fact that, as we know, and again, not surprising here, that the biggest impact of the shutdown occurred on those sectors of the economy which relied on face-to-face or close social experiences. And that the key word there is the leisure and hospitality sector, where you can see the unemployment rate in a matter of 2 months went to almost 40%. You can see the subsequent decline in that, and we'll look at some actual numbers regarding that in just a moment. The second most impacted sector was what's called other, but this is the sector that has things in it like dry cleaning services, health clubs, and so on. Services that were dramatically impacted. By and large, you can see that unemployment rates are now trending back towards a norm, or they were at least as of November. We'll get a jobs report out tomorrow morning with an update on this. It's generally been the case, and this is this is very telling and extremely important, because it has accomplished what Jerome Powell indicated needed to be accomplished, and we'll see that in a slide in a moment, namely preventing the economy from going into long-term damage. And typically in a recession, when people lose jobs, because people lose jobs, more people lose jobs. They take that spending out of the economy, it causes further contraction, you end up in a negative spiral. That's not happened here yet, by and large, and it hasn't because of the extraordinary fiscal support that we've had from Congress and monetary support we had from the Fed. The one exception to that case is you can see in mining and extraction, where the unemployment rate actually is higher now than it was early on, and this is entirely on account of the reduction in energy consumption and the shutdown of oil drilling, where we've lost jobs in that sector. This is the detail behind some of the numbers here. I want to point out here that in terms of leisure and hospitality, 8.3 million jobs were lost in the first 2 months following the pandemic, and as a result of the shutdown. Almost half of the jobs in that sector in February. Other large sectors were education and health. 2.7 million jobs lost there. And again, one of the surprising comments, or one of the surprising impacts of the pandemic, was that in terms of the contribution of GDP by sector, the sector that had the largest decline in contribution was not leisure and hospitality, but in fact it was healthcare. Something a little counterintuitive. Now, since then, we have seen that, in fact, with the exception of mining, you can see it up there, and that's where that's mining and extraction. So oil production falls into that category, and a modest change in utilities. We've had a significant snapback in employment in leisure and hospitality up to November, but we know those jobs are particularly at risk with the third wave that we're going through right now. In Connecticut, Connecticut itself, the job experience has reflected the national experience, and this bar is truncated here. We lost 104,000 jobs during the year up until November. I don't show the trough and then the recovery. This is 2020 changes in November. This bar, of course, would have gone way out over here, but to show you some of the detail of what was happening in other places. And again, the two largest sectors being impacted here in Connecticut were leisure and hospitality, and education and health services, very similar to what the national experience was. And again, the course of the pandemic here in Connecticut, this looks different from the national chart. We don't see three waves here. These are deaths. I'm sorry, it's both cases and deaths here from COVID-19. The deaths are reported in the orange line here. And sadly, the Connecticut has the fifth highest death rate in the United States, 173 deaths per 100,000 of population. That's somewhat similar to New Jersey and Massachusetts. New York City, though, unfortunately, of course, not counting them as a state, but New York City has the highest rate at over 300 per 100,000. Of course, it was partly because of our proximity to New York in the early stages that we have a rate that's like that for the state. So as we look forward to 2021, we see three keys to the future. And no surprise, of course, the first key is the course of the pandemic. The second one will be, or is, government policy regarding both fiscal support or stimulus, and then monetary policy. And the third one is the underlying fundamentals, because once we get number one solved or past it, we're going to be relying back then onto the underlying fundamentals of the economy, and we'll talk about that. But first of all, we've got to address the question of the shot in the arm. And here's a little bit of detail. Human beings are subject to infection and illness from 7 different coronaviruses right now. Of those 7, 4 of them cause conditions like the common cold and are not particularly severe or pose that much of a public health threat. Then we have the 5th coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-1, severe acute respiratory syndrome. This was a coronavirus that first became evident in Asia in the year 2003, and unfortunately, it has been largely contained and controlled. The second more deadly version of the coronavirus was the MERS virus, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus, which occurred in Saudi Arabia in 2012. The third one is this coronavirus that we are dealing with right now in its several variants, which is technically called the SARS-CoV-2 virus. What's different among these? Well, we certainly perhaps can recall some of the news reports about the original SARS virus and then the MERS virus. And one of the reasons those are not in the news right now is because they were in fact more deadly than the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So somewhat ironically, the fact that the SARS-CoV-2 virus is not as deadly as its two more severe predecessors here is a reason why it has spread more effectively, and why ultimately it is in fact a greater public health threat than any of the other 6 coronaviruses, 4 which are relatively mild in impact, and 2 which in fact are much more serious and more deadly, but they don't spread then on that account. So we're dealing with this virus worldwide right now. Our hopes are pinned on vaccination, and I think that's reasonably a reasonable hope. We expect that there could be as many as 6 effective vaccines available here in the United States and Europe within the next several months. We have 2 already approved in the United States. The AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine has been approved in the UK and the European Union, and there's the expectation that will be approved here in the United States later this year or later this spring. There's a biotech team at Jefferies, the financial analyst firm, led by the 2 individuals there, Yi and Tsai. They looked at the potential supply from as many as 6 different vaccines, and by their estimate, we could have 1.2 billion people vaccinated worldwide by June 30th and 5.1 billion vaccinated by the end of the year. So in fact, vaccine supply is not likely going to be a constraint in dealing with the pandemic, although as we know what's happening in the United States right now, the logistics of that distribution, though, will be a challenge. But I think that's something we can get by. But vaccination does not mean that the virus will be eradicated. If anything, it's likely to go from a pandemic to an endemic virus, meaning that it is something that we will be living with from here on out, like we live with the flu viruses. And 3 very critical questions remain to be answered regarding the vaccine in terms of then addressing the question, how long before we get to normal? And those 3 questions are, first of all, the question of sterilizing immunity. We know that the vaccines are highly effective at preventing disease, with the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine both having effectiveness of 90% or more. What we don't know, and it'll take some time before we find out, is whether or not those vaccines are effective at essentially sterilizing the individual who gets them so that they cannot carry the virus and spread it. We don't know that yet. There is the possibility that it will not have that sterilizing effect, and therefore, even though an individual has had the vaccine, they could still be a vector for the virus. The second thing we don't know is the immunity endurance. How long will the vaccines, how long will the immunity that an individual who gets a vaccine, how long will that last? There is some good news out of that on that score, but it's very small scale. The La Jolla Immunology Institute in La Jolla, California, did a small-scale survey of 185 people who have been who came down with COVID-19. They've tracked what their experience has been in terms of antibodies, and then also in terms of T cells. And what they found was that although the antibodies declined, the memory T cells that are key to triggering the body's response to any future encounter with that virus had degraded very little. And on the basis of that small study, and it's just one study, we could be looking at immunities that would last at a minimum of 3 to 4 years from a vaccine, perhaps longer. We'll need to see whether or not that is proven out by other studies. If not, then we will be subject to a course of repeat vaccinations. And then the third question is the question of herd immunity. And this has been in the news recently. You saw that one of our politicians, and I'm not recalling who it was at the moment, was criticizing Dr. Fauci because Dr. Fauci had increased his estimate of what the exposure would have to be in the population to achieve herd immunity. And what is herd immunity? It's that level of exposure either through vaccination or actual encounter with the virus and the disease, whereby the virus can no longer effectively spread because so many people are immune to it. The initial estimates and hopes were that that immunity level would be between 60 to 70%. I think epidemiologists are looking at that more carefully now, and this is why Dr. Fauci made the observation recently that he thinks that the herd immunity level is going to be higher than that and could be as high as 90%. All these things factor in here, both in terms of level of consumer confidence, but it also then comes into play in terms of achieving herd immunity, that is with people's willingness to get the vaccine. When I look at this, and I have to say this is this is my opinion, that the hopes that we have for getting back to normal in the second half of 2021, I think are falsely placed. We need to get the answers to these questions, and we need to achieve herd immunity, and I don't think we're going to get there in 2021. So that's the pandemic side. The next issue is fiscal and monetary policy. And Jerome Powell, of course, the chair of the Fed, in an address he gave in October, listed three things that he said fiscal and monetary policy, or monetary policy in particular, needed to achieve. We needed to provide stability and relief. We had to limit longer run damage, and it has to support the expansion when it comes. We've seen the impact that the initial virtually $3 trillion of support that was provided by Congress through the CARES Act and the two legislative acts that preceded that. It had a significant impact on people's real income. We saw that in an earlier chart. You can see it here in terms of the rate of personal savings. I just note this goes back to 1960, actually 1959, and the rate of personal savings soared during the early part of the year, and it soared because people were getting $1,200 checks and they saved those checks. Many of them did. We saw that then in terms of just bank deposit levels in savings, and I could show you a similar chart for checking accounts too. This is again a long-term chart. You can see that bank deposits don't change very much generally from one point to another, but again, they really soared here in early 2020. We've seen that level come down though, and that level coming down is an indication, of course, that people are utilizing those savings to support their household economic needs, and that was, of course, part of the purpose of those sending out those relief or stimulus checks, depending on how you want to characterize them. We would have been in a very tough spot had Congress not extended the unemployment benefits that they did through the bill that was signed by Donald Trump on December 27th. And of course, with the additional payments authorized by that, that's going to provide an additional boost here to savings. But those benefits, particularly the unemployment benefits, only will extend for 11 weeks. They'll expire in March. And given the course of the pandemic, I do expect that Congress will be called upon to provide additional support. President-elect Biden has indicated that he's willing to do that. He called the December bill just a down payment, and so I think we'll see additional support, and that will be vital. In terms of conditioning, providing support on the financial side, in terms The Fed expects to keep rates at near zero for at least the next 2 years. This isn't a chart you've seen before. This is what the Fed publishes quarterly when they give their own estimate of where they think rates are going to be. It's an interesting exercise that they predict their own behavior. But of course, their behavior will evolve as conditions evolve. But as things stand right now, every member of the Federal Open Market Committee expects that interest rates, that the policy rate will remain effectively at zero throughout this year. And everyone but one person expected that it would remain at zero, effectively at zero throughout next year. And the predominant opinion is that it would stay that way in 2023, but we do have some individuals who expect there'll be some increase. The Fed directly controls, of course, short-term interest rates. They do not have as much control over long-term interest rates, although they have exercised some of that control with bond buying recently. So when we look at all of that, the conditions, what's happened, and where we think things are going, we expect strong growth this year in 2021, followed by decelerating growth towards a slower long-range growth potential of the U.S. economy, which I'll get into at the really end of the presentation. More stimulus could boost 2021 to between 4 to 5%. Many economists have said that if we get another $1 trillion relief or fiscal stimulus package from Congress in the first quarter, we would see a higher growth rate for 2021. I agree with that. And so these numbers, we're not assuming an additional $1 trillion. If we get that, our growth rates here for 2021 will be higher than what I'm showing you. We expect that what's going to drive that growth is going to be a recovery in the personal consumption of services, with some additional boost from the housing sector of the economy. So this somewhat complicated chart here shows you our projections for total real GDP. This is inflation adjusted for 2021, 2022, and 2023. The solid bars here representing the projection for 21 and so on. These are the top level components of gross domestic product on an expenditure basis. It's personal consumption on services, personal consumption on goods, business investment, exports, imports, which are a takeaway, state and local government, federal government, and residential investment. We all know that personal consumption is 70% of the economy. It's these two sections here. But in fact, the consumer has a lot to do with all of the other sectors here. I'm always amused when I hear individuals express some surprise at the fact that 70% of the economy is due to consumers. That's somewhat of a comparison, say, with economies in Europe or in state-controlled economies, where so much more of the economic activity is directed by the state. But looking at our society and our economic system, most of it's directly driven by the consumer, and even that which isn't directly driven is largely in response to the consumer, whether it's residential investment for demand for housing, whether it's government expenditures, which we all have a say in through our vote, whether it's business investment in terms of businesses responding to the needs of consumers for production. The level here of 3% for next year, largely driven by this 3.3% increase projected in service consumption. And I want to show you some detail on that. We have become, over the course of the past 50 to 60 years, an economy that is driven by services rather than by the purchase of goods. If I'd shown you this chart going back to 60 years, you would see that the purchases of goods, the blue line down there at the roughly $3 trillion level, $3 to $5 trillion level, would actually be on top of the level of the line for services. But several decades ago, that switched, and that's typical for a mature, wealthy economy. We spend more money on services than we do on stuff. The surprising thing about it was that the pandemic changed that balance, and you can see that reflected here. Services plummeted and then have recovered somewhat, but are still well below what the pre-pandemic level was. Goods purchases also plummeted, but in fact rose above the level of pre-pandemic. So in fact, the economy, generally speaking, and consumers are buying more stuff now, more goods, than they ever bought before, despite the general state of the economy. And it's no surprise. I'm sure that you have some of this experience in your own life or your neighbor's life, and that is, it's largely a replacement effect. Those people who have managed to maintain jobs and maintain income, they haven't traveled, they're not going out to eat, they haven't taken vacations. What have they done? They've spent money on their house, they bought a new car, they've upgraded their appliances. I was talking to a colleague of mine that said, yes, we didn't take a vacation, but we put in a swimming pool. So that swimming pool is in this line here, and the not vacation, is in this gap in here. So as we go forward into 2021, this balance between goods and services is going to be a key determinant of where the economy goes. In my opinion, I think we're going to see goods purchases slack off, which will actually cause somewhat of a headwind as the demand for services increases. Here's the detail in terms of the breakout of our services expenditures for households, totaling prior to the pandemic about $8.2 trillion, $8.3 trillion, and this is all inflation adjusted. So if we were to bring this up to 2020 dollars, this would probably be on the order of $9 to $9.5 trillion. But you can see that some sectors here of services didn't change or changed very little at all. One of the largest ones being housing and utilities. Again, not a particular surprise there. The biggest change that occurred as a result of the pandemic, we've talked a lot about leisure and healthcare. The biggest one, though, was in the purchase of healthcare, where we see a decline here of, on an annualized basis, almost $400 billion. You can see the drop in, in food services here. It's the blue from 770 to 514, recreation services to 458, 246 here. But the biggest change was in healthcare, where people simply postponed, put off, or canceled the healthcare services that they would have otherwise received during this period of time. It has bounced back somewhat, but that was the biggest impact, actually, of the shutdown. So, and our expectation is that that's going to come back, and based on the pandemic and the population's response to that, social distancing, returning to a willingness to go out to eat in a crowded restaurant or to a movie theater, we expect to see a recovery in the travel and leisure component of that. The other piece that I mentioned as being a prime mover of the economy would be residential investment. This, I have to say, shocked me when I saw this. Home ownership in 2020 has soared, and these words, these exaggerated words, I used very carefully. But I think there's no other way to describe this increase in home ownership. This is the year-over-year rate going all the way back to, if I read that right, in the mid-60s. We rarely had a year-over-year change in the rate of home ownership that varied by more than 1%. And here, in the early part of 2020, we saw the rate of home ownership rise by almost 4%. That, of course, reflects the changed behavior of consumers in terms of where they want to live, and to some extent in terms of millennials. Do they want to be in apartments in city centers? We've seen a big impact of that in housing values in Fairfield County, where people moving out of New York City, wanting to get out of that densely populated area, have bid up the prices of homes there. And despite the fact that we have seen rising home prices, home buying still is affordable. This is the affordability index, which says that for an individual making the median household income, they have 150% of what the income necessary to buy a median priced home in the United States at standard 30-year fixed rate mortgage financing with a 20% down payment. This is a segment of the economy that we think the Fed is going to be careful not to put at risk. And therefore, although there will be some pressure on longer term interest rates to move up as the economy recovers, we think the Fed's going to be careful to control the extent to which those long-term rates rise. And although they don't have a direct lever on that, they do with their bond purchasing program to be able to affect those longer-term rates. Along with that propensity now for people to own their own homes, be outside of city centers, we see now that home builders are responding to that, and the home builder index is now the highest it has been over the time series, and I think it just started in 1985. So again, another sign of good things, the best of things during this time when so many things are not that. Unfortunately, that impact of housing, I mentioned its impact in Fairfield County. That's sort of anecdotal, but it is true nonetheless. But housing in Connecticut and housing values in Connecticut have had a hard time of it ever since the Great Recession here. This band spanning from 08 to 09. The housing values here in Connecticut roughly starting at the same level as U.S. housing values generally, going all the way back to the 70s. But you can see that throughout, up until the Great Recession, and even 5 years, 6 years after it, housing values in Connecticut were still above the national value of homes. That has changed. It swapped over here somewhere late 16, and since then, housing values in the United States have, generally speaking, have outstripped those in Connecticut. That, unfortunately, is also true when we look at our neighbors throughout New England. If you take a look at what the change was in the Great Recession, the peak housing values, so let me just go back. I think I can do this. Housing generally peaked, it peaked somewhere here in the 2007-2008 range, and this is true for most areas throughout the country, and true in New England. So when we look at, all right, how have values recovered? How far did they drop? How far have they recovered since then? So this chart here shows that. Overall in the United States, values dropped from their peak by 19%. They then subsequently recovered 51%, leaving values 22% above that peak level prior to 2010. You can see that for every other state in New England and for Long Island, housing values have recovered to a level higher than what they were prior to 2010, their peak level. 19, 14, Rhode Island just at 2, Vermont at 13. Not true for Connecticut. Unfortunately, we experienced a drop in housing values comparable to the national, but our recovery since then has been slow and meager, leaving housing values, generally speaking, in Connecticut 9% below where they had been prior to the peak before 2010. So taking a look at a couple other sectors of the economy, which are relevant here for, particularly for Connecticut. one of that is manufacturing. Connecticut does have a significant presence in advanced manufacturing, high-tech manufacturing. Um, some of that largely connected with the aerospace industry, aviation and aerospace. But it's been an important sector to Connecticut's economy. And generally speaking, not just in the advanced manufacturing sector, but in manufacturing sectors across the board, inventories are low. Um, Retailers and wholesalers, for that matter, have been reluctant to stock up in view of the uncertainties about the economy, and as a consequence, because inventories are so low, the note here, and our chief investment officer actually put this slide together for me, showing that we're going into a restocking cycle right now, where manufacturing is going to be booming just to build up the inventories that retailers and wholesalers need to meet demand. And for those of you who were trying to buy things at the end of last year, in anticipation of the holiday season, probably encountered some of those shortcomings. I'm going to flip ahead quickly here to get to the last couple of slides to leave some minutes for some time for talk or questions. This is one of the other surprising things about the experience that we've all gone through in the past year. But it is typical of times of stress in the economy and recession. And that is, those times typically end up accomplishing what economist Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. There are businesses, enterprises, and so on that aren't well suited to the world as it's unfolding. They get destroyed. But one of the things that has happened is that new business formations this year, and these are business formations of businesses with employees. So this isn't an individual going out in a sole proprietorship. You can see they have soared here. Also, part of this also might be attributable to the fiscal support and a generally low level of interest rates for individuals and businesses starting up. So, there's some important green shoots here in the economy that we can look forward to. So, I talked about the negative spiral that one can get involved with, that the economy can get involved with when we lose jobs, and the loss of income and spending creates the loss of more jobs. Well, generally speaking, we're more frequently engaged in the virtuous cycle equivalent of that, and that is where, in fact, more jobs create more income, more spending, more investment, and then more jobs on top of that. That's where we had been for the past 10 years up until February and March when we shut things down. So we take a look at that and we say, well, are we going to start another virtuous cycle in 2021? Are we starting one? Or is this just going to be what we've described here as a sugar rush, namely a boost of economic activity that's going to leave us sort of flat afterwards? I think, in fact, that we're going to have a little bit of a sugar rush, but also leading to the onset of a virtuous cycle, perhaps not as strong as what we've had in the past 10 years leading up to March. So looking beyond 2021, two issues. Getting back to normal. I think I had promised that I'd have some descriptions on that. And then also coping with the long-term growth constraints. As we get beyond 2021, somebody asked me, one of my colleagues, well, are we just going to turn the lights back on? Are we going back to business as usual, or as we did before the pandemic? That we aren't going to be doing that. The normal we get back to is going to be a new normal, and it's going to be significantly affected by changes in behaviors that the pandemic has wrought. Some of those behaviors might fade as we go forward, but there's no question that some of them are going to be persistent, and they're going to require adaptations to how we deal with the customers, employees, and what I've described generally here as business infrastructure. Everything from the spaces that we use and occupy to vehicles, technology, communications means, and so on. And this new normal, it's going to be the challenge for all of us. And I count my own business, working in wealth management for People's United Bank as part of that. We've seen a burgeoning of e-commerce, and again, that's been no surprise. People are cautious about going out in crowded places or going out in stores, period. So we've seen that burgeon. But we've also seen the growth of e-commerce in services, whether it's medical diagnosis, education, and I expect that that's going to continue. And to the extent that our particular enterprises are going to be challenged by that, we're going to have to figure out how to do that. Of course, in terms of employees, for those who can, remote working, working from home, not needing to live near to an office or a place of business in order to be a productive employee. And in some cases, I think businesses are going to be challenged to figure out how to accomplish that, and so on. The notion that everybody's got to work in the same place, which was certainly the case when people worked in factories, that model is breaking down, and that's going to be a challenge for us. Education and training and team building and synergy are all in the same thing. How do we accomplish building teams that have synergies to them and work together when people are not working elbow to elbow or office next to office as much as they might have done in the past? I already mentioned the infrastructure question about how are we going to utilize space, both at home and on the job, and the technology in order to support those different uses. And lastly, I'll talk about long-term constraints. And this, to my mind, is key because it sets the level of our longer-term growth expectations against which everything, I think, needs to be metered. We've talked about, or I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, the potential of getting to a 3% growth rate. Or a sustained 3% growth rate. I don't believe a 3% sustained growth rate is possible. And it's the demographics that argue against that. U.S. population growth is slowing. It is right now the slowest it has been in its history. I have a chart that actually goes back to 1720 to show you population growth rates over that time, but I didn't think it was necessary here. Population growth is slowing and is projected to decline even further. U.S. fertility is below the natural replacement rate, meaning that the population as it exists today is not having enough children to replace itself. That's part of a long-term global trend for advanced economies. There are a number of things that go into that: inclusion of women in the workforce, access to more reliable and low-cost birth control, options for women other than childbearing. All of these things go into it, and the trend we see here in the United States is playing out in every other advanced major economy in the world. The United States right now and for the foreseeable future will be entirely, and I underline the word entirely dependent on immigration for growth in its labor force. And even with that level of immigration, on average of around 800,000 per year, that's only going to get us to a growth rate of around 0.4% per year. So the standard formula for GDP is population growth plus productivity, or growth in the labor force plus growth in productivity. We have all lived in and grown up in a country accustomed to a higher population growth rate, and thereby to a higher GDP growth rate. That's not going to be the case going forward. So we're going to have to scale back our expectations of what baseline GDP is. The other thing about the United States is we're getting older. Our average age is 38.3. Expect by, and this is not 10 years, but by the year 2040, it's going to be 41. By the year 2050, it's going to be 42, around 43%. Older people don't buy as much stuff. They don't need to. Japan sells more adult diapers than baby diapers, and we will probably get to that point in the United States here, not very long. So in terms of the dynamics of what the consumer wants and what we can sell to the consumer, that's going to be changing, and all of that is a headwind for baseline GDP growth going forward. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's the sign of a mature economy, a mature and productive economy. So I think I'm going to stop there. I've got a couple charts here on the investor sentiment cycle, but to give some time for questions, I'll stop. Oh my! I see I've used up the hour.
Yep, we are at that 2 o'clock mark. So if anybody has any questions for Bert, please post them in the questions panel, and we will try to get to them right now. We only had a question about if we are going to have recordings available of today's webinar. We are going to have those, and everybody who attended today is going to get a follow-up email with the YouTube link to today's broadcast, in case anybody else had that same question.
Oh my.
So I'm just gonna hold on to see if any other questions come through for Bert to answer if possible, but we do appreciate this. I learned a lot. I kind of like how you went into what is actually happening, not just on a financial standpoint, but how that kind of tied into all of the events happening in America right now. It was very interesting.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. Economics isn't all equations, and it's a good thing, because if it were all equations, I wouldn't be doing it.
All right, Joni, I think a question came in. I don't know if Joni's logged on anymore, but anyway, a question did come in from Gail. She said, do you have any insight as to how this has impacted the insurance industry?
I'll give the standard response. That's a great question, which is always, of course, a stall technique, because all questions are good questions. One of the interesting things that a colleague of mine pointed out to me a month or 6 weeks ago was that if you look at overall death statistics for the United States, you find that, in fact, the rate of total mortality has not been much affected by the pandemic. In a way, then, the pandemic has essentially taken the place of other diseases and other conditions that have caused, that typically cause death in the population. The reason I cite that in answer to the question is I suspect that, and I haven't gone to see how that statistic has changed recently, but if that is the case, and I have no reason to doubt that it is the case. My colleague is a real quant who pointed that out to me. That would indicate that, in fact, in terms of the impact on the life insurance industry, the pandemic's probably had little to no effect on the life insurance industry. We do know that because of the changes in consumer patterns of travel, where they're working and so on, that in terms of property and casualty insurance, it's reduced the demand for that with people driving less. How that's going to play out in terms of sort of property insurance in particular for business office spaces, and whether there will be some adjustment for homeowner use for business applications. That I haven't seen those questions raised yet, and not that they haven't been. I honestly haven't gone looking for them, but I wouldn't be surprised if those do pop up as actuaries start looking at the loss experience of people working from home, and how that might affect risk exposures.
Sure. And then there's two other great questions here from Drew and Josephine. I guess also your opinion or take on the future of the aerospace industry in Connecticut, and or if you can touch on both if you have time, also the wedding industry of 2021. So aerospace and weddings.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Well, in terms of aerospace, one of the things that Connecticut has an advantage of, and a competitive advantage, and that is a skilled workforce. That sector of the economy here, we can support with that skilled workforce. Now, we've already seen the large number of cancellations that Boeing has experienced for future airplanes, and to the extent that that there is a slower travel recovery, that's going to affect, of course, the demand for airplanes, and that will have an adverse effect on demand from suppliers here in Connecticut. It's been a very hard hit industry. I would say I haven't worked out any of the percentages or numbers to see what sort of a recovery in travel would be necessary in order to provide some boost to that. But that's going to take some time to play out. In terms of the wedding industry, that's a very interesting question. Again, boy, that's a pandemic question there, and I'm hopeful that this summer's experience is going to be better than last summer's experience, both because of the weather, helping dampen the spread of the virus, and with a larger degree of vaccination. So I hope that we can get back to having large-scale gatherings for that. That is partly, candidly, partly hopeful, though.
Yeah. All right. I haven't seen any more come through, and it is almost 2:10, so I am going to wrap it up. But Bert, thank you very much. I think a lot of people got a lot out of today's presentation. And if anybody has any more questions for you, are you able to give your email address to me? Possibly I can put that in our email going out to the attendees today, or... Sure.
Yeah, I'm embarrassed that I didn't actually have it on the cover page, because I usually try to do that so that people do have it. It's albert.brenner@peoples.com. If you got a question on that, I can email it over to you, but albert.brenner@peoples.com.
Okay, perfect. We appreciate your time today. I hope you have a great 2021, and we hope to talk to you again. All right, everybody, please have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.